with you tonight about witchcraft legends from Massachusetts. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'm excited to share some spooky stories and some interesting historical information with you. And as Robert mentioned, if you want to have any questions for me, you can submit them via the chat function, and we'll get to those at the end of the night. So Robert mentioned some of these things already. Sorry, let me just get to my slideshow here. Give me 1 second. Hold on. Okay, there we go. First, just a little bit about me. I was born in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and I've been interested in folklore, legends, and myths my entire life. I've been writing about New England's folklore for quite a few years. I started with a blog, New England Folklore, in 2008, and I still update that blog several times a month. In 2014, I published Legends and Lore of the North Shore with the History Press, which was a lot of fun to write. I've also had pieces published in 13 Most Haunted Crime Scenes Beyond Boston, Magical Folk, British and Irish Fairies, 500 AD to the present. I contributed a chapter about New England fairy lore. And then most relevant to tonight's talk, an essay called Witchcraft Never Died and the Real Witches of New England. All those Robert mentioned. I also was a guest on Mysteries at the Museum in 2016 to talk about the legendary melon head monsters of Connecticut. Okay, so that's enough about me. I'm going to cover 3 historical eras tonight. We're going to talk about the Puritan era. So there were 50 years of witchcraft, actually more like 70 years of witchcraft accusations and trials in Massachusetts in the 1600s. And that sort of ended with the Salem Witch Trials. And this era was when witchcraft was a crime. It was very, very serious business. In the 18th and 19th century, there were no longer any witchcraft trials. And although belief was fading, some people still did believe in witches during this era. You also see a lot of interesting legends and stories from this time period. And finally, we're going to talk about modern witchcraft legends. There are still legends about witches being told here in Massachusetts, but they're often phrased as paranormal encounters or ghost stories. And they're often tied to certain spooky locations that people go to visit. So we'll talk about these 3 eras tonight. So really, before we get into the particular eras, let's talk about what is a witch. Here we go. There are a lot of definitions for witch, a lot of different definitions for that word. So for the purpose of tonight's talk, I'm using this older classical definition. A witch is someone who causes harm through magical means. I'm not talking tonight about Wiccans or other people who practice magic today. That's a religious tradition, that's a spiritual path, and that's very different from how people in New England would have viewed witches, 400 years ago, 200 years ago, 100 years ago. So I'm just going to talk about witches as someone who causes harm through magical means. It's sort of the older meaning of the word witch. And just to clarify, I'm also not going to talk about the witchcraft beliefs of the Native Americans who lived in this area before the Puritans came. There's a lot of rich information there, but it would have to be its own topic for its own night. So tonight I'm really focusing on sort of the dominant English-speaking culture and witches as someone who causes harm through magical means. So let's start off. Massachusetts was colonized by English Puritans in the 1600s. Plymouth was founded in 1620, Salem in 1626, Boston in 1630. So when you think about it, this was almost 400 years ago, and this is well before the Enlightenment and well before the scientific revolution really took place. And so just to put the Puritans in historical perspective, some of the first colonists here in Massachusetts could have seen Shakespeare's plays performed live on stage for the first time. So this is a long time ago. This was basically the late Renaissance. So they had very different beliefs about the world than we have now. Many of the Puritan colonists also came from part of England called East Anglia. And this is an area where there was a very strong belief in witches. The biggest witch hunts in England happened in East Anglia. And so it's no big surprise, I think, that the biggest witch hunts in America happened in New England, which was settled by people from East Anglia. They basically brought their witchcraft beliefs with them from England to North America. So what were these beliefs? I mean, basically, they believed that certain people were witches and had the ability to harm others through magic, usually because the witches were angry, greedy, or jealous. It's not exactly clear how witches had this power or why they had this power. The Puritan clergy were sort of up at the top of the social hierarchy. They generally believed that it was because witches had made a deal with the devil. And if you look at a lot of witch trials that are presided over by the Puritans, they're often trying to get this information out, like, did you sign a book with the devil? Did you sign a contract with the devil? But on the other hand, the average Puritans generally didn't share this perspective. So the average Puritan, when they talk about witches, they don't talk about the devil, they just talk about a witch. And for the average Puritan, witches seem to have been just sort of part of life, something that had to be endured or dealt with, almost like bad weather, like you just had to deal with these witches somehow. So what exactly did they think witches would do? They believed, first of all, that witches could disrupt a household. They thought witches could bewitch the bread so it wouldn't rise. They would hex butter so it wouldn't churn, so it wouldn't come together. They would make farm animals sick or misbehave, or they would curse the family's loom so no one could weave cloth. And so these would be minor inconveniences to you or me, but these were serious problems for the Puritans since they had to feed and clothe themselves pretty much entirely. Like they couldn't just run to the store and buy butter if the butter didn't churn, and if your livestock died, this meant you might starve. So these were serious problems if a witch was disrupting your household. They also believed that witches could experience all sorts of strange phenomena. And these are really some weird, interesting things. They thought that witches might cause poltergeist activity, where objects would fly around the house, the beds in the house would shake, stones would be thrown through the windows or down the chimneys by invisible hands, things like that. They also believed witches could appear at night in somebody's bedroom, where they would pinch, stab, or choke somebody as they were trying to sleep. Sometimes witches would do this in their own human form. Sometimes they would do it in an animal form, or sort of a half human, half animal monster. And sometimes the witches would also send demons to do this for them. And so the demons were generally called familiar spirits because they were familiar with the witches. They were like family to the witches. The Puritans also thought that witches could ride their victims like horses all night long and leave them exhausted and sore in the morning. And there are plenty of stories about witches showing up in somebody's bedroom at night with this sort of magical bridle that they throw over their victim's mouth, and they ride the victim all up and down the New England coast. And then in the morning, the victim is sore and their mouth is sore from having, the bit stuck right there in their mouth. So that's a lot of strange phenomena they thought witches could cause. They also believed that witches could cause physical harm. So witches could cause illness or convulsions. Witches could lock the jaws of their victims to prevent them from speaking. They could make them bark like a dog or laugh uncontrollably. They could force them to contort their body into very painful positions, and they could even cause death. So witches were a serious matter here. Now the Puritans also believed there were ways to fight back against witchcraft. If witches caused harm by magic, you had to fight back with magic. You had to fight fire with fire. So here are a few examples of defensive magic that the Puritans would use. You find these in witchcraft trial records and other records from that time. For example, you could prevent a witch from entering your house by hanging a horseshoe above the door. And you still see this sometimes now. People say, oh, it's for good luck. But 400 years ago, this was to keep a witch out of your house. People also would bury metal items under their front doorstep or in their fireplace. And again, these were means of egress. And so the metal item prevents the witch from getting in. So there are records of people, burying knives, harpoons, things like this. They buried them under the doorstep or in the fireplace because these were places a witch could enter your house. You read about people putting bay leaves around the doors and windows of their house, again, to prevent a witch from entering. So these are ways you could prevent a witch from entering your house. But if someone actually was bewitched, you had to try other tactics. One of the most popular ones involved taking the urine of the person who has been bewitched. So the person the witch is attacking, you would take their urine and put it into a bottle along with nails, broken glass, anything sharp and painful. And the idea was that this would somehow rebound the witch's magic to them and cause them pain. So you're basically taking a part of the person who's bewitched, sticking these sharp things in it, and then with the idea that it will travel back to the witch and cause them pain. In a similar vein, people would often burn the hair of someone who was afflicted by a witch with the same idea that this will help cause pain to the witch will feel the heat that's in that hair and be burned. In a real basic level too, if it's not a person who's bewitched, you could just beat or burn whatever object was bewitched. So if the butter isn't churning, you can just take that butter and you throw it in the fire. And if your cow is bewitched, you would just beat it with a stick, or sometimes you would cut its ear off. And so there are quite a few stories where someone takes the butter and throws it in the fire, and suddenly the next morning, their neighbor shows up with a burn on their face, like, oh, see, that person clearly was a witch. Or if you cut the ear off your cow, the next morning your neighbor shows up and they've got like a bandage over their ear that's bloody, like, oh, clearly that person is a witch because they have the same wound that I inflicted on my cow. And so just a note here, like, it's pretty obvious that Puritans are much crueler to their animals than we were. So just like, don't go around cutting off the ears of your cow. I don't really recommend that. So those were a few ways the Puritans thought they could fight back against witches. But if everything else failed, you would finally just take them to court, right? This is what you did. You try all your defensive magic, it fails, you're just gonna have to take this witch to court. And witchcraft was a criminal offense in Massachusetts, just like murder or theft. It was a very serious matter, so you wouldn't accuse somebody lightly. I just wanna be completely clear here that there were no real witches in New England during this era. No one was magically riding their neighbor like a horse. No one was magically ruining the butter. The people who were accused of witchcraft were generally women who were eccentric or unpopular with their neighbors for a variety of reasons and wound up accused of witchcraft. It wasn't always women, but it's predominantly women, and we'll get into the reasons in a little bit. But in general, people who were accused of witchcraft were people who were already unpopular with their neighbors for a variety of reasons. Between 1620 and 1691, there were at least 83 trials for witchcraft in New England. And so this is before the Salem Witchcraft Trials even happened. So 83 witch trials in Massachusetts, Connecticut, the areas that are now Maine and New Hampshire, things like that. From those trials, 11 people were executed, and 5 of them were executed here in Massachusetts. And the 5 people who were executed before the Salem trials were all women. So these are their names. Margaret Jones was the first person executed in Massachusetts. She was a healer who lived in Charlestown, and she would cure illness with herbal remedies. And she was very successful at this. And she was so successful that people actually suspected that she was using magic to make them sick, just so she could sell them medicine to make them feel better, which is kind of some twisted logic. Some neighbors also said she had a demonic spirit in the shape of a small child that would do her bidding. So she was executed in 1648 by hanging. And all the executions were by hanging. All executions for witchcraft in New England were by hanging. No one was ever burned here. It's always hanging. Alice Lake in Dorchester, the documents from her trials are very incomplete, but we do know that before being accused of witchcraft, she had been convicted of having premarital sex, which was a crime at the time. And she also confessed to trying but failing to abort her first child, which was another crime. But unfortunately, we don't know the specifics of the witchcraft that she was accused of, since the records are incomplete. And sadly, it seems like the courts really seems to have convicted her based on her previous crimes, which in our mind are not actually crimes at all. Elizabeth Kendall lived in Cambridge, executed 1651. Documents are pretty sketchy here as well, but it seems that she was accused of killing a family's newborn baby through magic, and executed for it. After her execution, it was discovered that the baby really died because a nurse left it outside in the cold too long and it got sick. But unfortunately, that did not come to light until after Elizabeth Kendall had been executed. So that's kind of a big, I mean, all of these are tragic, I would say. Anne Hibbins lived in Boston. She was hanged in 1656. And Anne Hibbins was a very wealthy woman. She and her husband owned land in Boston. They owned a house in Boston. They also owned large tracts of land outside of Boston. And she owned the land actually where I live right now, which is, I just learned a while ago, which is pretty surprising. Anne Hibbins was also very argumentative and got excommunicated from the church she belonged to because she was so argumentative. And being argumentative was unacceptable behavior for a Puritan woman in Massachusetts. When her husband, who was politically well-connected, died, Anne was then accused of witchcraft and executed in 1651. And her name may be familiar to you because Nathaniel Hawthorne incorporated her into the Scarlet Letter as a character. Finally, we have Goody Glover, who lived in Boston, executed in 1688. She was an Irish washerwoman living in Boston, and one day she lost her temper and screamed at a customer's daughter. After this, the daughter and her siblings all exhibited strange behavior after this, and so Goody Glover was accused of witchcraft. She was also Irish, she was Catholic, and she spoke mostly Gaelic, so all of these things probably contributed to her guilty verdict in a city dominated by English-speaking Puritans. And just a note here, like, Goody is not actually her name. Goody is short for goodwife, which was a term similar to Mrs., which was used in the 17th century. And so we could have like Goody Kendall, Goody Lake, Goody Jones, Goody Hibbins. I mean, Anne Hibbins was wealthy, so she probably would have been Mistress Hibbins. The others would have been Goody, Goody, Goody. We just don't know Goody Glover's real first name. Tradition says it was Mary. So Puritan society placed very strict rules on behavior for women. And as you can see, most of the women executed as witches broke those rules in some way or another, whether by being argumentative, having sex outside of magic, or just being very successful business people. They were just breaking the rules, and unfortunately they paid for it. So the rules were less strict for men at this time, social rules, but men were also accused of witchcraft, just in lower numbers and without any executions before the Salem trials. So no men were executed in Massachusetts before the Salem witchcraft trials. But here are 3 men who were accused of witchcraft, which we can just look at these, sort of compare them to the women who were executed. So we have John Bradstreet of Rowley. He was accused of witchcraft in 1652. He was a local troublemaker. He had been whipped for lying, and he had been put into the stocks in 1651 for using obscenities in court. So he was a kind of a low-grade troublemaker. In 1652, he was accused of having a book about magic and of hearing a disembodied magical voice telling him things. So he was fined for those things. John Godfrey, who lived in Essex County, he was an itinerant herdsman. He lived in multiple cities. He never had a place that he settled down. So he lived in Haverhill, he lived in Ipswich, he lived in Andover. He was argumentative, and he even bragged at one point that he had made a deal with the devil to become a witch. So naturally, no surprise, people accused him of various acts of witchcraft, including sending animals like crows and snakes to attack them. He was put on trial for witchcraft 4 different times, but he was never convicted of witchcraft, although he was convicted of other minor crimes, though. And finally, we have Caleb Powell in Newbury in 1679. He was a sailor. He was accused of bewitching a boy who lived in Newbury. He was found innocent of witchcraft, but the judges fined him anyway because one of his shipmates said he had bragged about knowing magic, particularly astrology. So he knew astrology, so I thought, well, we'll fine you for that, even though you probably aren't really a witch. I think it's interesting to note that 2 of these men dabbled in magic. People did practice magic during this era, things like astrology, fortune telling with tea leaves, palm reading, all of those things. And these are things that people still do now. So it was pretty common in the 17th century, but the Puritan clergy did frown on it. They thought most magic was straight from the devil. And it could unfortunately lead you to being accused of witchcraft. And it's interesting that John Godfrey actually bragged about being a witch, and there were a few other cases of people, mostly men, who did this as well during this time. Like people would brag like, oh yeah, I signed a deal with the devil and now I'm a witch. And it was basically a way to seem sort of edgy, make yourself seem kind of aggressive and tough in a Puritan society. Of course, it was sort of a risky thing to do, because if people took you too seriously, you could end up on trial for being a witch and possibly in jail, or in the worst case, executed, though none of these men were executed. So I think it's interesting also to compare and contrast what men could get away with what the women couldn't get away with. Okay. Now, obviously, the most famous Puritan witch trials were those that happened in Salem in 1692. Over 150 people were accused. 19 people were executed. That was 14 women and 5 men there. So 14 women and 5 men were executed. 1 man died while being tortured, and 3 women and 1 man also died in jail. So this was a really big tragedy, a really big event as well at the time. And as you've probably noticed, like other witch trials during the Puritan era were much smaller. And I think there are a few reasons why the Salem trials were so much bigger than the other ones that came before them. I think the first thing is that the Salem witch craze basically began when 2 girls supposedly became bewitched. They started to, bark like dogs, they couldn't talk, they were contorted in strange shapes, all these things. These 2 young girls were members of the Salem village minister's family. And ministers' families had not been bewitched before. Like, this was very unusual that a minister would find his own children were bewitched. So this led people to think that the devil was spiritually attacking the Puritan church, which was at the heart of Massachusetts. So this was not your average witchcraft incident when these 2 girls became bewitched. The colony at this time was actually under physical attack at this time by local Native Americans, who many of them were backed by the French in Canada. And the Puritans were living in a big state of anxiety and fear. Many people actually living in Salem at the time of the Salem witch trials were refugees from Maine who had seen their villages burned and their families killed. And so they had fled from Maine down to Salem. And then in Salem, when the witchcraft trials, when the witch craze started to begin, people were looking for someone they could punish and someone they could act out on, someone they could blame. So you couldn't punish these Native Americans, but maybe you could punish these witches who were living inside your own village with you. And finally, the judges presiding over the trials believed there was a vast conspiracy of witches. If a suspect pled guilty and gave names of other witches, the suspect was not executed. So if you wanted to live, you would have to name other people as witches. Only the people who pled innocent were executed, which makes you realize how bizarre and how unjust the whole situation was. So if you wanted to survive, you would plead guilty and then you would name names. And then those people in turn, if they want to survive, they would plead guilty and they would name names. So you can see why this sort of metastasized and just spread to get 150 people accused. Earlier trials, only involved a few people, not 150. And I just want to say that those explanations come from a book by a historian named Benjamin Ray. It's a really good book. It's called Satan and Salem. It just has lots of interesting facts like that in it. So although the Salem trials began in Salem, people from across the state were accused of being witches during this. And several of them lived in what is now Tewksbury, which at the time was actually Billerica. So probably the most famous of them was Martha Carrier, who lived she lived near what is now Yale and Shawsheen Streets in Tewksbury, and she lived there with her husband and her children. After living in Tewksbury, they later moved to Andover, and when a smallpox epidemic broke out in Andover, they were blamed for it. People thought that Martha had brought the disease to town with her, and naturally this made her very unpopular in Andover. And when the Salem witch trials occurred, she was accused of being actually one of the ringleaders of the vast witches conspiracy. One of her accusers said that the devil had promised Martha Carrier that she would be the queen of hell, right? That's a big title for a witch. She would be the queen of hell. Martha pled innocent, but 2 of her teenage sons were tortured into confessing that she was a witch and that they were witches as well. And then her 8-year-old daughter also confessed that she was a witch and her mother was a witch, which is pretty terrible. And so Martha was found guilty of witchcraft and executed on August 19th, 1692. Roger Toothaker also lived in what is now Tewksbury, and he was married to Martha Carrier's sister, Mary. Roger was a farmer. He also worked as a healer, so an herbal type of doctor, and people actually called him Dr. Toothaker. Before the witch trials began, he bragged that he knew how to find witches, that he'd even taught his daughter how to kill them using magic. But he found himself accused of witchcraft himself by the servant of another local doctor when the Salem trials began. So perhaps this was just a case of professional rivalry. that got escalated to a deadly level. Roger was not executed, but he was sent to jail in Boston, and he died there of natural causes, probably malnutrition. Roger's wife, on the other hand, when she was accused, she pled guilty, and she said that she had signed the devil's book to become a witch in order to get protection from Native American attacks. So that's why she said she'd become a witch. She was sent to jail in Cambridge, so a separate jail from her husband. She was released when the trials ended. And ironically, she died in 1695 when Native Americans raided Billerica. So her fears, unfortunately, did come true. The Salem trials ended in October of 1692. So October of that year, they ended. Sentiment had been growing against the trials as people saw how they kept expanding and expanding and expanding. Like people were slowly becoming aware that this is not good, this is not normal. And in October of that year, the bewitched girls in Salem accused the governor's wife of being a witch. And in response, the governor just said, that's it, we're shutting down these trials, and that was the end. So that was sort of the final straw that brought the whole thing down. So that's a very quick history of Salem witch trials. There are many, many books on this. I just wanted to give an overview with a focus in particular on people who would have been living in or near Tewksbury around that time. A lot of legends have developed around the Salem witch trials, sort of separate from the history. These are a couple legends that are probably true, but I'm not sure if they're 100% true. So we're gonna say they're, 90% likely to be true. Giles Corey, he was the one person who died during torture that I mentioned. He was a Salem farmer, accused of witchcraft in 1692, and he refused to confess, and he actually refused to talk at all. He did not say a word when he was accused. And in order to make him talk, the Salem sheriff staked him to the ground and piled heavy stones on top of his body. They piled on more and more and more stones until finally he died. And that's a fact that's documented. Now, according to tradition, when the stones were being piled up on him, the sheriff asked Giles Corey one more time if he had anything to say. And Giles Corey supposedly said, "More weight." Those are his only words. He said, "More weight." So then the sheriff piled on more stones until Giles died. So those are sort of his famous last words, "More weight." According to legend, Giles Corey's ghost haunts the Howard Street burying ground in Salem, which at the time was a field, and this is where he was staked to the ground. And I think that's pretty much known, that he was killed in what is now the Howard Street burying ground in Salem. And his ghost supposedly appears in Salem when the city is threatened by a disaster. For example, his ghost appeared before the Great Salem Fire of 1914, when large parts of the city burned down. The other person who has an interesting legend around her, which is probably 90% true, is Sarah Good. Sarah Good was one of the first people accused in the Salem trials. She was very poor, she had a really bad temper, and she liked to swear at people. And so this naturally just led to her being accused of witchcraft. And she was also therefore very quickly found guilty of witchcraft, probably because she was so unpopular. At her execution, it was being presided over by the Reverend Nicholas Noyes, a Puritan minister. He was there standing by the gallows, watching everything happen. And as Sarah Good stood on the gallows, she said to him, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The Reverend showed no mercy, however, and she was hanged. Several years later, though, Reverend Noyes died of a brain hemorrhage, and blood ran out of his mouth as he died. And his family at that moment, like, "Oh, right, that curse that was put on him." And so this sort of became a famous incident in Salem history, and at least that's the legend behind it. And if this may be familiar to you, if you read The House of Seven Gables, because Nathaniel Hawthorne takes a version of this and puts it into his book. And just an interesting fact, one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestors was a judge during the witch trial, John Hathorne. And when Nathaniel Hawthorne became an author, he added the W in his name just to distance himself a little bit from that infamous ancestor. Okay. So let's move on to the 18th and 19th century. We got a little time left. The Puritans learned from the Salem witch trials that you can't prove witchcraft in a court of law, right? It's just impossible to do. But this didn't mean that people in Massachusetts stopped believing in witchcraft after the Salem witchcraft trials ended. They just stopped holding trials, right? There were no more trials, but people still believed in witchcraft. So here are a few examples showing that how people continue to believe in witchcraft in the 18th and 19th century. In 1720, 3 girls in Littleton started to have fits and exhibit strange behavior. So classic bewitchment, like they're barking like dogs, they can't speak, they can't drink, etc. These 3 girls said they were bewitched. And when they were pressed to identify the witch, like who is bewitching you, they named one of their neighbors. And that was a woman named Abigail Dudley. Luckily, the local reverend doubted the girls were telling the truth. He's like, yeah, I don't know if this is real. And then unfortunately, Mrs. Dudley died shortly after this, giving birth to her 13th child. So this was basically the end of the whole matter. Mrs. Dudley died, the reverend's like, no, this is not witchcraft, so it didn't go any further. And then 8 years later, one of the girls, when she was older, she confessed to a minister in Medford, Massachusetts, that she had made the whole thing up just to get attention. So you can see how it was there was no witchcraft involved here at all. Let's jump forward quite a few years, 120 years later. We have a Pepperell resident named Absalom Lawrence, and he suspected that his 13-year-old daughter was bewitched. She was suffering from strange contortions, she was unable to speak, and she wouldn't eat. There were also strange phenomena in the house, so pots and pans banged when nobody was in the kitchen, weird groaning sounds were heard, like, that sort of sound, and the butter wouldn't churn together. And so these are all classic witchcraft symptoms, but it's 150 years after the Salem trials, but it's still happening in Pepperell, Massachusetts. So clearly, like, no judge in 1843 is going to hear a case like this. So Absalom Lawrence hired a wandering hypnotist named Dr. Nevins to help him out. Dr. Nevins traveled around with a female assistant whom he would put into a hypnotic trance. And when this assistant was put into a trance, she identified the witch as an old woman who lived nearby. And she also said that the old woman would come invisibly on a horse and enter the house through the keyholes or the cracks under the door. And the assistant also noted that the invisible horse did not have any horseshoes on it. And this is because we know that witches are allergic to horseshoes, so they're not going to ride a horse that has horseshoes on it. But as I said, no judge would hear this case, and there was not much that Absalom Lawrence could really do, even after he figured out who he thought the alleged witch was. Eventually, he moved his entire family to Hollis, New Hampshire, and that's where he is buried. You can go see his grave today. And once they moved to Hollis, New Hampshire, his daughter recovered. And so this story is not a legend. This story was covered in local newspapers, sometimes with a little bit of mockery. But again, it was happening in Pepperell, Massachusetts. I will say that by 1843, cases like this were becoming quite rare in Massachusetts. I think most people were no longer viewing witches as a dire threat, but instead as something kind of entertainingly spooky, something maybe you talk about around the fireplace at night, something to scare the children. It's not like as serious as it was in the Puritan era. So in the 1700s and the 1800s, you tend to see more legends about witches rather than court cases or outright accusations like this one with Absalom Lawrence. So witches are becoming more legendary, I think, than something you would encounter in your day-to-day life. So here's an example of a classic legend from Massachusetts, from Gloucester. Peg Wesson lived in that coastal city in the 18th century. As may be familiar to you by now, she was unpleasant and curmudgeonly, and so therefore people thought she was a witch. That's sort of a standard thing by this point, right? One day in 1745, a group of drunken young soldiers harassed her on the street. They were being sent up to Quebec to fight against the French, and therefore they were feeling quite brave. And they said, we're going to harass this witch in Gloucester. Peg responded to their harassment. She said, "You'll feel my wrath in Quebec. You'll regret the day you harassed Peg Wesson." So, the soldiers just laugh this off like, aha, we're young soldiers, we don't care. They're shipped off to Quebec, and they quickly end up in a heated battle with the French. Suddenly, as they're fighting the French, a big crow appears in the sky above the Gloucester soldiers, and it swoops down and claws at them again and again and again, and it just won't stop attacking them. They shoot at it, but their bullets don't hurt it. And finally, one of the soldiers remembers what Peg had said and realizes that the crow is really Peg in bird form. So he takes one of the silver buttons off of his uniform, he loads it into his musket, and he shoots. He hits the crow, and with a hideous croak, the crow just vanishes. And then, the French are defeated, and the Gloucester soldiers celebrate, and like, yay. So that very same day, though, back in Gloucester, Peg Wesson goes to see the doctor, saying she has broken her leg. But when the doctor looks at her leg, he sees that she's really been shot and that there's a silver button embedded in her leg. Okay, so Peg Wesson was probably a real person. I don't know if anyone's ever found her grave, so it's not clear if she was a real person or not. And this helps you see how belief in witches lingered into 17th and 18th century, but you can also see how the belief is starting to change into pure legend. Like there's no trial involved here. There's no bewitched children trying to take an old lady to court. It's really just a story about the supernatural, right? It ends when the doctor finds that silver button, like dun, 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 silver button. And here's another example of a witchcraft legend, and it's about a swampy pond called Dinglehole, which is in Millis. And Dinglehole is kind of a silly name to us, but the pond got that name because of an eerie bell that is supposedly heard ringing at night near the bell. It goes dingle, dingle, dingle. So the pond was supposed to be bottomless, and people also said that a headless ghost haunted the woods around Dinglehole and would walk around with a lantern at night. But even scarier than the ghost was the devil, who would gather near Dinglehole with his witches, and they would gather there to plot their evil plots. The witches didn't come in human form, though. They would come as small woodland animals like weasels, skunks, and raccoons. So these looked like normal woodland animals, but as this legend will show you, they didn't necessarily act like them. So one evening, a hunter was walking home past Dinglehole when he saw a big raccoon sitting in a tree, and he shot it right in the chest. Nothing happened. He shot it again. Still nothing happened. The raccoon just sat there staring at him with its big eyes. Thinking the raccoon might actually be a witch, the hunter plucked not a silver button, but a branch from a nearby witch hazel bush, which is a plant that supposedly has magical powers, and he fired the branch from his rifle like a harpoon. And it hit the raccoon right in the face, and the animal, of course, vanished. Then the next morning, a local woman named Murky Mullen, who was suspected of being a witch, had an unexplained wound on her face. So Dinglehole, that's a real place. It still exists in Millis. It's much smaller than it used to be. It's basically in somebody's front yard now. And some people in Millis still remember some of these stories about it. And it's also supposed to be bottomless, a gateway to hell, things like that. Was Murky Mullen a real person? Maybe, but I'm not sure. But definitely you'll notice the similarities between this legend and the legend about Peg Wesson. They're both about proving that witches are real and how the evidence shows that somebody is a witch. And they both follow the same basic formula. Person encounters a strange animal, wounds the strange animal, and then someone the next day exhibits the same wound, therefore they're a witch. And really, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of legends just like this in New England, all the way up to the early 20th century. So this is a very common theme, about how you find out someone's a witch. Okay, so that's the 18th and 19th century. Let's jump ahead to the modern era, so late 20th, early 21st century. You'll still hear legends about witches in Massachusetts even today, but they're sort of a different kind. And happily, they aren't about proving that your crabby neighbor is a witch. Instead, most of them are ghost stories with sort of a witchy slant. So it's probably not a big surprise that people say Salem's haunted, given its tragic history. I already mentioned Giles Corey's ghost, but his wife's ghost is also said to be seen near the place he died. And the Pickman House, which is a 17th century house that overlooks Salem's Charter Street burying ground, is said to be haunted, as is the historic Salem Witch House, which is pictured here. And the witch house was actually not owned by a witch, but by one of the judges, Jonathan Corwin. And the staff who work there claim to have seen objects moving around on their own and doors open and shut when no one is there. So it's sort of a classic ghost story, but with a sort of a witchy slant there. And people still say you can experience those phenomena there today. Of course, there are other places in Massachusetts said to be haunted by witch-related ghosts as well. This is kind of a strange one. There's a dirt road in North Andover at the intersection of Barker and Bradford Streets that is nicknamed Albino Road, and it's supposed to be haunted. So according to a local legend, a young couple settled on this land in the late 1600s. They established a small farm, and the wife gave birth to twin boys. The boys were born with pale white skin and pale pink eyes. They were albinos. Their parents were afraid their Puritan neighbors would think they were some type of monster, and so therefore they kept these two boys hidden away. As the boys grew older, the parents warned them never to leave the farm and to hide if anyone came to visit. Unfortunately, one day in 1692, a neighbor came by unannounced and saw the two boys who were now teenagers. He summoned the local constable, and the boys were taken into custody. The town leaders devised a test to see if the boys were demons. They were tied up and thrown into a lake, and if they sank to the bottom and drowned, it was felt they would be demons. If they floated to the top, they were human and would be saved. Unfortunately, the two boys sank and drowned, and so therefore the town leaders said, oh, this is proof they're humans, and then they burned down their family's farm. And ever since that time, according to legend, two pale ghostly figures have been said to haunt the road where the farm once stood. They hate trespassers and will harm anyone who goes down the road at night. So I think that's a good spooky story. I've been to Albino Road. These are photos I took while I was there. So it's a good story. It's purely legend, like there's no fact behind this. There's no evidence there were ever two albino boys accused of being demons. And the story about them being drowned in a pond seems like a garbled version of the water test, which is where suspected witches were thrown into a pond. But in the actual water test, it's reversed. If the suspect floated, this meant they were a witch since the water rejected them, right? The water rejects the witch, so they float. The water test was never practiced in Massachusetts, though, and the Albino Road actually has the floating or sinking reversed. But still, I would not go to Albino Road at night. I mean, who knows, maybe it's not a witch-related legend, but it still could be haunted by something else, right? So, and plus, I don't want to get any deer ticks on me. Okay, we're going on to another great story. Dudley Road in Billerica is also supposed to be haunted, but this time it's by ghostly nuns who practiced witchcraft and worshiped the devil. And well, at least that's the legend. And it claims that in the 19th century, some nuns in a nearby convent decided to turn away from God and go to the dark side. They would sneak out of the convent at night and conduct satanic rituals in an abandoned house on Dudley Road. And eventually the locals discovered what they were doing because the nuns chanting apparently was very loud. So you could hear the satanic chanting echoing around the neighborhood. And so they hanged the nuns from a tree. And ever since that time, the nuns' ghosts have haunted Dudley Road. They can be seen hanging from the same tree they died on, and they can be heard chanting in the abandoned house, which is supposedly sinking slowly into the earth. Other ghosts have been seen on Dudley Road as well, and only the brave will go there at night. Like I went there during the day. So I'll just say, much like Albino Road, this story is purely legend. No one was hanged for witchcraft in Massachusetts in the 19th century. There were no executions in the 19th century for witchcraft, and certainly not a group of nuns in Billerica. That just didn't happen. This is basically a classic urban legend attached to an old country road where teenagers like to go at night and scare themselves. But like the Albino Road story, you can also see how the memory of historic witchcraft trials, like the hanging from the tree, kind of informs this story. So also like Albino Road, like maybe it's not haunted by ghostly nuns, but maybe it's haunted by something else, so I'm just not gonna risk it myself. Okay, so this final story I'm gonna tell, the final modern story, comes from a book called Dark Woods, Cults, Crime, and the Paranormal in the Freetown State Forest. So it's Dark Woods, and that book was written by an author named Christopher Balzano, So Christopher Balzano, he wrote this in 2007. I just want to give him credit because it's a great book. He interviewed dozens of people who live near the Freetown State Forest, which is down near Fall River, and collected their stories of paranormal encounters, ghosts, etc. So this is a good book if you like something that's nice and spooky. So one young man named Dave told Balzano that he and some friends had encountered a witch in the forest when they were boys. It all began one day while they were out in the woods playing and they heard a woman laughing at them. They tried to see who it was, but they were unable to see her through the trees. And so the boys ran off because they were scared. A few years later, when he was 10 years old, Dave had a dream one night that he was an adult man who murdered his wife in the woods because of her adultery. And so I think that's a pretty freaky dream for a 10-year-old to have. He would also sometimes dream about a gray-haired woman who would try to get into his bedroom at night. She would stand outside his bedroom window begging to come in. And so Dave, he thought these were just dreams until one day he and his friends discovered the foundations of an old house in the woods. And Dave realized it was the same dream, the same house he had seen in his dream where he had supposedly murdered his wife. And then as he and his friends talked, Dave learned that his friends had also been dreaming about a gray-haired woman trying to get into their bedroom at night. So they were kind of wondering, like, is this just a dream? Is this real? Is this a living person? Is this a ghost? They didn't know. The boys continued to encounter this witch-like figure for several years. Sometimes they would see her lurking behind the trees in the forest. Sometimes they would see a large black cat around their houses or in the woods. And sometimes this black cat walked on 2 legs. So you know that this is not your average black cat. And often the witch would continue to come to their bedrooms at night and kind of knock on the window asking to be let in. And so this went on for quite a while until finally it really only ended when these boys grew up and moved away from the Freetown State Forest. So just some historical notes here, like Christopher Balzano talked to people at the Freetown Historical Society. There's no evidence that anyone ever lived in the Freetown State Forest, so I'm not sure what the foundation of the building is that the boys found. And they don't have any evidence of anyone being accused of witchcraft down in Freetown. So I really have no way of knowing like if Dave's story is true or not, but I will note that it is basically a classic New England witch story, but in a modern setting and possibly with a ghostly twist. If the witch is a ghost, it's hard to say, right? But we've got an older woman who's kind of living, in this case, literally on the fringes of society. She's living in the forest, so she's outside the rules of society. We've got some behavior that's not normal, this sort of dream about adultery in the past. We have children who are being tormented by a witch, particularly at night while they're asleep. And then we have the black cat, who often shows up in a lot of witch stories as well. So these are all elements that would be right at home in a 17th century witch story or even a 17th century witch trial. But here they are in a story that was told to Christopher Balzano in 2008. So it's really interesting. I think you can see how the stories about witchcraft don't really die out. They just change with the times. They kind of keep evolving, they keep adapting. They don't die out, they just change. And I'm pretty sure that people will continue to tell witchcraft legends in this area for many, many more years to come. So that is the end of my formal part of the